I thought maybe what I could contribute here is to pull the camera back into a sort of broader political context, to offer, I think, to support the rationale for expanding employee ownership. In fact, I would say the urgency of it. The rise of Donald Trump as a voice for the disaffected, largely as a voice for those who have been losers in globalization and automation. The mirror image of that is the rise of Zoran Mamdani as the likely next mayor of America's largest city, who is himself becoming a voice for the disaffected, for the losers in globalization and constant concentration of corporate power, of the attenuation of capital and workers that we see in our economy, and the frustration of young people who feel they have no stake in the economy. In fact, right now, current polling would suggest that in France, Le Rassemblement National, otherwise formerly known as Le Front National, the party of the Le Pen family, a far-right populist party, is clearly in the lead to win both the next round of French legislative and presidential elections. Now whether they can because of the runoff system in France is a different matter, but what was considered, in the past, the conventional wisdom was that the ceiling of popular support for the Front National in France was about 30%, and they're now blowing well into the mid-40s. So it is not inconceivable that Le Front National could take control of the French government. In Germany, the party that's leading the polls nationally and in most regions now is the Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD, a far-right populist party. And in the United Kingdom right now, astonishingly, if an election were held today, there would be a majority Reform Party government led by Nigel Farage. Now, these parties are different in different ways, and I would argue the Reform Party in the UK is not nearly as extreme or as nasty as the Front National or the AfD, and nor would I argue that these things are identical to the MAGA phenomena in the United States, but they all but in each of those countries, by the way, the center has completely cratered. In each of those countries, to the extent that there is an alternative on the left, it is no longer the traditional labor parties. In Europe, they're at their weakest point in their history, but in fact, it's parties of the hard populist left that are emerging, like Jean-Louis Mélenchon in France, and I would say that's a kind of echo of what's happening in New York with Mamdani. So what I'm painting for you is, and I think thankfully here in Canada, we have largely been inured from those kinds of trends of extremism. But you will notice that there is increasingly a populist flavor in Canadian politics, which is a reflection of the frustration that people have with the functioning of the modern economy, the neoliberal, let's call it Davos consensus, of ever more free trade, globalization, automation, governments run by technocrats, and ever larger accumulating pools of capital that are the owners of business. This is dangerous. This is very dangerous, I think, to the future of democracy and our democratic societies. And it seems to me that one of the primary drivers, there's no one cause for these trends in our politics. Some of them would be, amongst other things, high levels of migration, particularly illegal and irregular migration, leading to rapid demographic change and the consequent effects on the labor market, the suppressive effects on wages. You see that in Canada right now over the debate on the temporary foreign worker program. You would see it in the asset inflation, where asset-rich individuals like mortgage-free home-owning boomers have done very well in the housing lottery here and through most of the developed world. But it means that assets have become, home ownership has become an impossible dream for an entire cohort of people, for essentially people under the age of 40. In this country, home ownership is impossible to aspire to, creating great frustration. The consequences of contracting out and globalization, the hollowing out of the U.S. Rust Belt. You know, it's no coincidence that Trump won both of his elections thanks to flipping traditional union-based industrial states in the Rust Belt to his side, people who are the losers of automation, whose little factory towns were flattened as jobs moved to China, to Mexico, and to be honest, many of them moved to right-to-work states in the U.S. South as well. And so the frustration with that, the fact that people no longer, increasingly in today's modern economy with the ownership moving to these huge accumulations of wealth, to private equity, to hedge funds, to pension funds, that have no direct connection to the communities in which they operate, has, I think, further fueled this populist alienation and this deep frustration, as well as other things like the problems that, what happens when you take these towns, for example, in the U.S. Rust Belt, and you take out the 2 or 3 main traditional manufacturing employers, and what you end up with are towns with a sense of hopelessness, despair, turning to crime, addictions, the opioids crisis, and social disintegration. The brilliant U.S. sociologist Charles Murray depicted all of this about 10 years ago in a very, very important book entitled Growing Apart. And he basically took social science data to compare 2 fictitious communities in Ohio. One that was a university town plugged into the digital economy where people's incomes continue to go up, their disposable incomes, their kids are going to private schools, they could afford the best health care. And another town 30 miles away, which was a hollowed out shell of a former industrial town with sky-high levels of social dysfunction, addiction, crime, and all that entails. And part of his thesis, part of Professor Murray's thesis was that this kind of thing was unthinkable in earlier periods of our economic history. We see a lot of this in southern Ontario, by the way, as well. If you go to a town like St. Mary's, Ontario, or Stratford, Ontario, or all the Chatham, Ontario, go to all of these towns and look at the empty factories. Very typically, those were factories owned by families who lived in those towns, whose kids went to the same schools as their workers, who worshiped at the same churches, who gathered in the same community halls, who shopped in the same stores. I think, for example, of the Beattie family. Some of you know Perrin Beattie, the former president of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. His great-grandfather started an appliance manufacturing firm in St. Mary's, Ontario. And for 3 generations, that family, the owners of the town factory, lived in the community, played with their friends and neighbors, and had a sense of real solidarity with the folks that worked in their plants. If somebody fell ill or there was a death in the family for one of their workers, the owners of the factory were there offering condolences the next day. Well, that is no longer the model. If the ultimate owner of the factory is a hedge fund in Zurich or a private equity firm in New York or a pension fund in London, this growing attenuation between workers and owners, between the actual capital and the owners of capital, I think is creating a crisis for capitalism. And that is being reflected in this increasingly dangerous populism. So I think one of the key solutions to this is employee ownership. Employee ownership that recenters capital with the workers who actually do the production, where they are committed to their local communities, where automation is embraced not as a threat to the future of the company, but as a way of improving its performance, because the workers who are the owners have confidence that they will not be the victims, but in fact the beneficiaries of investments in technology, automation, and digitization. So I think you're really onto something. I think it's urgently important, and perhaps more so in Canada than elsewhere because of the existential threats that we are facing to our economy emanating from the South. We have the succession crisis, boomers whose kids don't want to buy their businesses and are desperately looking for owners. But so often when I hear this in the advisory work that I do, the owners, they want a good price, for the business that they and or their parents developed over decades. Of course, they want a fair exit, but usually at the top of their list, as they're looking for buyers, is somebody who's committed to their workers, committed to the craft of what they have built, committed to continuing on the legacy and the tradition. And that is very often not the case if they sell to some massive private equity or pension fund. And so the employer ownership model offers them, and the employer ownership trust that you succeeded in establishing in law last year, I think offers a elegant opportunity for them to exit and pass on the legacy of their family-owned business to the workers with whom they have collaborated for decades. So, and that also allows us to keep those companies here in Canada and not end up being acquired pennies on the dollar with a huge currency discount by private equity in the United States, God forbid. So I just want to come here to say thank you for what you are doing. Thank you for the example that many of you are giving of successful employee ownership models. Thanks for pushing the public policy in the right direction. But I want to encourage you to redouble your efforts. The notion that the capital gains provision for employee ownership trusts will expire in 2026 is really unhelpful. Listen, I was 20 years in Ottawa as an MP. Half of those years in cabinet, I've been Premier of Alberta. I was always a fiscal hawk. I was always conscious about protecting the tax base, always conscious that you can't have an effective tax system and generate revenues if you create an infinite number of tax advantages. But for goodness sakes, I cannot think of a single compelling public policy or fiscal reason why they would wind down that capital gains provision. And they almost certainly won't. They almost certainly won't. But the bureaucrats in the tax division of finance, and by the way, Prime Minister Carney used to be the Associate Deputy Minister for Revenue at the Department of Finance, so he gets the vibe. They want to protect the tax base, so they're very protective about extending long-term provisions like this capital gains provision. But I think given the economic crisis the country is facing, the outward flight of investment, the 20-year decline in productivity and competitiveness, the decade-long decline in per capita GDP, the fact that Canadians are now, on a per capita basis, less well off than people in the poorest of the 50 United States, Mississippi. All of these fundamental challenges require bold actions. And here is a perfect policy remedy to address the succession crisis, the outflow of capital, the protection of small and medium-sized enterprises here in Canada, in a way that appeals to people right across the political spectrum. There are precious few issues where you actually get virtual unanimity in politics, and this was supported by all parties. So you certainly have I'd like to offer to help you get this across the line in terms of extending that, and whatever other policy signals are required to move forward employee ownership. I'll just close by saying that one of my political heroes was Margaret Thatcher, and she grew up in a shopkeeper's family. She grew up above the shop, a little store that her parents ran. She understood that kind of family-owned enterprise was really the core of a successful economy, and she believed in what she called popular capitalism. She had the vision of an ownership society, which is why she allowed working families to purchase millions of what were known as council flats, social housing units, to move ownership from the state to the families, who then had a sense of pride in the preservation and the protection of the value of that property. And when she privatized large British Crown corporations like British Rail and so on, there was always an opportunity for the workers to be the first in line to buy shares and to become co-owners in former state-owned enterprises. So I think we need, if we're going to save democratic capitalism from its own current failures, we're going to need to latch onto that vision of an ownership society. And I think employee ownership here in Canada is the smartest way to start. Thank you very much.